Problem.
Okay, I'm recording now. Welcome to this special episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In today's episode, I'm joined by Patrick Irwin, who's a law and French student here at the University of Melbourne and has participated in the Menzies Early Career Network. This network has offered Australian university students a fantastic opportunity to engage with the history of the Menzies era while connecting with like-minded peers and respected figures in the field of Australian political history. So as part of Patrick's involvement in this program, he has contributed a chapter to a special project, our upcoming book, Finding Menzies, A New Generation's Inspiration for Foreign Affairs, Social Policy and Political Thought. Patrick, your chapter is Overprivileged, Menzies' Struggle with the Limits of Free Speech in an Episode of Political High Drama. Tell me, why did you choose this topic and what is this topic?
Well, first of all, thank you, Georgina, and I can see that my chapter has been put at the end of the book, which I hope is a compliment rather than an attempt to obscure it. So I've been assured of just as much. So, look, what fascinated me about this topic, which really takes place in 1955, so at the height of the second and the far longer Menzies government, was that their strategic situation was actually not dissimilar to the one we're in now. Came off the back, of course, of the Korean War, escalating tensions in Vietnam, significant strategic uncertainty in the Asia-Pacific, and in general a flavour of national crisis and of escalating tensions and uncertainty, which really I think mirror our own times to a large extent. And the response to this obviously is primarily one of national security and defence and foreign policy, but it also had domestic implications. Most importantly, the attempts, some successful, some unsuccessful, to limit and restrict the political expression which Australians were entitled to. There's, of course, the famous case of the Communist Party ban, and the less famous instance of it where it was effected successfully during the depths of the Second World War in 1940 and 41 and not immediately repealed by the successor Curtin government to Menzies. So there really were many attempts with which Menzies was familiar and an advocate to restrict free speech where it possibly threatened or risked national defence and national security, and I think that was not an uncontroversial position at the time. The second attempt, banning of the Communist Party because of its influence in trade unions and industry, was not successful legally. It was struck down by the High Court, but politically it was. And Menzies lived through an era of restriction of personal freedoms in the cause of national defence and national security when he was on campus. In fact, we're sitting in the Old Quad building at the moment, and he was actually here studying law when conscription came into place for the First World War, and it provoked massive furore on campus. There was condemnation from all quarters, and particularly by university administration and academics, about those who refused to go and serve. There was even calls from the then warden of Trinity College, Alexander Leaper, that no one who was not exempted from service for some sort of medical reason should be admitted to a college at the University of Melbourne. The famous communist academic Guido Baracci was thrown in the lake at Melbourne University for opposing conscription. So Menzies did live through all of this, and he had a thorough background in the restriction of personal freedoms.
And he was in favour of conscription through that time.
And in favour of conscription.
And famously then doesn't go to serve himself, although he wasn't conscripted, but his two brothers do, but he doesn't. So there was a tension there too, wasn't there? He advocated for conscription, yet didn't serve himself.
And that's what I think makes this particular topic so fascinating, which is that whilst this battle played out in Australian society writ large, it also played out within Menzies himself. He was famously fraught and internally torn between his duty to his family, which was to stay at home, particularly given his father's fragile mental state after his sister Belle's abscondment, but also at times...
A story for another day, but
a very good story.
Yeah.
I actually went past Menzies' house completely by coincidence recently and spoke to the current owner and saw sort of the window where she's supposed to have climbed out and all of that. But the point is that he was torn about this issue, about where personal freedom should end and the national interest should begin. That was something that went on internally within himself and also within Australian society at the time, which brings us to this fascinating episode about the contempt of Parliament case in 1955.
Well, I think before we get on to that, it's worth, I guess, reflecting on how, Menzies does have internal I guess disagreements, or he's challenged with his views on free speech versus his views on national security, and it's a tension that exists, as you say, to this day. But he writes about this while he's here at the University of Melbourne in his famous Bowen Prize-winning essay "Rule of Law in a Time of War." And then he gives lots of speeches on free speech through the 30s. Of course, in his iconic Forgotten People broadcast, he gives a whole speech on free speech. So there's a lot that he's written, but then, of course, there's what he actually does, and this is what you're about to tell us.
Well, that's right. And his express philosophy was set forth most explicitly in the second and third broadcast Forgotten People speeches. There were many published before that, but these were the second and third broadcast. And he actually only planned for there to be one broadcast on free speech. And that was the second one, which effectively expressed the classical liberal perspective, noting and warning against the drunkenness, he called it, of power that subsumes all governments and all elected representatives, and the need for the sobering salve of free speech to be a restraint on those in government and also those in the parliament. So that was the classical liberal expression of that. And after some criticism of that, basically there were a number of commentators afterwards who criticised him for calling on the press and for stating that the press should have a special status and a special ability to go far further than the average individual in their criticisms and in their public statement and what they wrote, which is not really what he meant. He decided to do another speech, which was the third broadcast of the series. And across these two, he made two very important caveats to the general position that speech is free by default, particularly when it comes to politics, which is, as we've discussed, in time of war, but also the express responsibility of the press to use its levers of power, use its ability to sway public opinion in a responsible way that's proportionate to the reach that it has. This is something that we probably don't understand to the same extent or appreciate inherently to the same extent that he did at the time, because really newspapers were the form of mass media. It's where everyone got their news. Everyone read them twice a day religiously, because it was the only real source of news apart from the radio, which was not as detailed and not as accessible. So we don't really have a medium like that. But for him, the press was everything. It was really the only way of politicians and of commentators.
And he didn't really like the press.
He didn't like the press. He thought they were a rabble. And he really condemns...
I don't know if many politicians actually do like the press that much.
I don't think so. I don't think so. And he, of course, famously, when he was in government, sort of lost it at journalists who would try to accost him in the ministerial corridors and saying, go back to the press gallery. So believed in the supremacy of elected officials, and in addition condemns sort of pressure politics. So the idea that a member of parliament effectively owes a duty to just find out what the majority of their constituents want and get up and say it like a sort of mannequin or automaton. He calls them a sounding board in Parliament. He really condemns that and believes in the independence and the sovereignty of the parliamentarian.
Yeah, he has the Burkean conception of the role of the parliamentarian, that they're elected for their judgment and their values, and that they should make decisions based on that rather than, just doing what the last person they spoke to told them to do.
That's right,
yeah.
That's right. And his basic conception harks back, I think, to the British principle of parliamentary sovereignty, which is not really the foundational principle of the Australian Constitution, which draws more from the American concept of popular sovereignty. But that basic principle was that once elected to Parliament, the Parliament is there to govern and to rule, and power rests with them supremely and ultimately, and everything else is basically a check on them. So,
and the way he thinks about Parliament, and he holds Parliament up as sort of the ultimate institution of our democracy, it feeds into this case that you're about to tell us, doesn't it? His views on Parliament are that it is sovereign and it can't be interfered with.
Well, that's right. And I think that's not controversial in a narrow sense, which is that we all accept that parliamentary processes should be allowed to continue unfettered and uninterrupted, and that Parliament should be able to enforce contempts on it, attempts to disrupt it or to damage it, or to harm or kill its members, for instance. I think we would all probably accept that as a matter of common sense. But Menzies took this a step further in this case. So in 1955, on the 28th of April, there was an article that was published in the Bankstown Observer by...
That august publication?
Yes, indeed, which is a species of publication that probably is almost a dying one in this day and age. It was called 4 full sheets of foolscap, published on a weekly basis. We would probably politely call it a rag these days, but it was basically a suburban newsletter published.
Someone's Substack these days.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
It would
that
be
not many people subscribe to, I'd say.
It would absolutely be on Reddit now, and it was published in the western suburbs of Sydney, in the Bankstown area, in the federal electorate of Reid, and the publisher of this had put forward an article which had been researched by a journalist, Fitzpatrick, and which had essentially stated that the federal member for that area, Charles Morgan, was involved in this sort of scurrilous illegal immigration scheme where he would get people over, primarily Italian and Greek migrants, after the Second World War in exchange for kickbacks, basically getting them through an illegal back door. And it was incredibly defamatory. If a modern publication published that, they would rightly be condemned for it, and there would rightly be a successful civil suit against them. But Menzies took this a step further. So it was referred to the Privileges Committee of the House of Representatives, who investigated it in this sort of thorough but secretive manner. So until much later, the reports of the Privileges Committee were not published. So all their proceedings were in secret, and they brought forward Brown and Fitzpatrick, these two newspaper men, and effectively charged them with explaining what they had done and why they had published this article and whether it was true. They'd found that it wasn't, and this report was tabled to Parliament, and the two men were brought before the bar of the House, which is like a bronze bar that lowers over the entry to the House of Representatives, and were more or less put on trial for contempt of Parliament. And contempt is a famously loosely defined concept. It's enshrined in the Constitution as being the same as the defined contempt for the House of Commons in Britain at the time of Federation. And for every contempt, there is a privilege, or for every privilege, there is a contempt. They're two sides of the same coin. Basically, the Parliament has special rights, and it has the ability to enforce those rights. Anyone who breaches those rights is guilty of a contempt, is the basic concept. But whilst some of these were set out in statute, particularly by the Whig administration of Rob Walpole, when he was in Parliament and Prime Minister of Britain for England and Wales for a very long time, they were not fully defined, and was effectively up to Parliament to decide what they were. And in this case, Menzies' basic view, when these men came before the bar, was that what they had engaged in was this pressure politics, this attempt to intimidate a member of Parliament, to compel them to do something, and to frustrate what he viewed as an incredibly sacred relationship between the parliamentarian and the people, which should be free from interference and which should be engaged in with only the utmost responsibility and good faith. So he eviscerated them, and they were denied legal counsel, which their senior counsel and later Chief Justice of the High Court, Sir Anthony Mason, condemned. There's a famous quote where he says, "My sense of outrage at this injustice and denial of due process remains undimmed over the last 40 years," which he said long after the case, and which you could absolutely understand from a lawyer's perspective, walking into what is effectively a court and having no ability to represent your client, to produce evidence, to make arguments, or for them to have a right to silence.
Yeah, a lot of denial of due process and natural justice there. But
well, that's
right.
I
mean, they end up being put in jail, don't they?
They do.
Brown and Fitzpatrick.
So this sort of trial went on. The two men were allowed to speak. They pled for mercy, but to no avail. And there was a cabinet meeting. Parliament rose, and there was a cabinet meeting where it was decided that the two men should be condemned, sent to jail, and there was a split vote on the Labor side. So the Liberal Party under Menzies voted for the motion, had control of the House, would have passed anyway. But interestingly, the Labor side, led by Doc Evatt, voted for it, and as did future Prime Minister Gough Whitlam. So there were a few interesting votes and a few interesting indications of people's conscience at the time. It was seen and argued later on that Evatt and Menzies were simply avid parliamentarians, had such great respect for the institution that they could not tolerate this sort of criticism. And it's also interesting to note, I think, that the criticism was against a Labor member of Parliament. It wasn't against one of Menzies' own people.
Yes, although there was some allegation, wasn't there, that Menzies was, and I think the clerk of the House at the time, Frank Green, had alleged that Menzies was out to get revenge on Brown for an article he'd written calling Menzies a coward for not serving in First World War, which we were talking about before. So who knows? I mean, what an extraordinary set of events. And Menzies, who'd been a barrister, a KC, he would have had an appreciation for the judicial system and due process, and yet he still thought that this was an appropriate course of action against these two men who, quite outside of Parliament, could have been sued for defamation and various, I guess, compensation could have been awarded to Morgan if the judge had decided. But an extraordinary an incident in our Parliament, a piece of history, but of course reveals a lot about that tension between respect for the sovereignty of Parliament, freedom of speech, due process, and the complexities of Menzies' approach to all of those things, Patrick. So well done on this chapter. It's fantastic, and thank you so much for participating in the Menzies Early Career Network.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Georgina.
It's great.